Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Nick Kanoki, Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I am very excited for a conversation with Daniel Platz and a presentation. He presented once not long ago, and we are excited to hear more. Mike, I think, is going to share some a slide of our members. And in general, thank you to our organizational members for help making this programming and other possible. And especially our Platinum member, Onuma System, and our patron members. Linda, Mike, I don't think is speaking today, but as you saw, Daniel from the United Nations.
That's correct.
Senior Economic Affairs Officer.
But they're a team, so we like showing them together no matter what.
Yep, and again, thanks to Onuma and our patron members, as well as all our organizational members that are really helpful for working with and supporting our mission to help the world with asset management. And now,
one organization at a time.
Yeah. Mike Bornero, Executive Director, welcome.
So Nick and I had talked about this before, and what's the mission of the Asset Leadership Network? And Nick was very strong on this can save the world, and has some really good arguments for that. But I haven't told you before, Nick, but I think we got to save the world, but one organization at a time, because everyone wants to focus on themselves and what they're doing. They can't think about saving the world. We're leaders, so we can think of it that way. But we got to save the world one organization at a time. And the United Nations is a great organization. It doesn't need saving, but we're very happy to help the United Nations get its message out. So Daniel, thank you for joining us again. And I am broadcasting from my friend Sharon Burns' property in Valparaiso. She has 17 acres of land, and she is going to have us document her land and her trees, because on October 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern, we're going to have Tree Storm, and we're going to talk about how to manage trees as an asset. And we've got Pepperdine University with LiDAR scans of their trees, and we're going to really get into this very important asset, which is trees. And maybe people can make some connections between trees as assets and have a light bulb go off and say, but hey, I can do that for my fleet or my IT, all these different things that benefit from a structured approach to asset management. And that's what we're so happy with. The United Nations has an excellent handbook on how to approach assets as in a structured governance approach. And you're feeling better this week, Daniel? Good. And we were sorry to miss you last week, but we had Linda join and gave us some good information on the templates, the examples, the guidance that you have in the handbook. So what was some of the interesting challenges and exciting things you learned from writing the handbook and publishing it?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. I am a little afraid I may repeat things that people already have heard. I think some of you had a chance to listen to me and Linda before, and then Linda said things. So please, Mike, stop me if I'm just like doing things over and over again. But I really appreciate the chance to dive a little deeper this time. I'm just going to put up very quickly the slide. I'm not going to go through a presentation. I just, for context, I'm just going to put up a slide that shows the handbook and a few, a little bit of the content and gives people a bit of understanding. I just hear that a little repetition can be helpful. So I keep it to a minimum. Okay, let me just share my screen 1 second and make sure I'm gonna go to the hopefully yeah, this should be it. So this is a very short presentation. I'm just not going to follow it religiously. I'm just going to put up a few slides, and then in that context, I'll talk about those challenges. Let me just see if I can go into presentation mode. That's loading. Okay. Hope you can all see it. It's asking me to turn on subtitles. Happy to do that. Let's see if they make sense. So this title is also sort of the title we use at the UN to describe our work on asset management. The first challenge that I encountered was to make it sound relatable. Actually, we started out calling it municipal asset management, simply because I, at the end, come from an angle of municipal finance and development finance, and we realized that a lot of focus is going into helping local governments around the world with their finances, and there's not nearly enough done on that. But a critical area that is overlooked is how governments do manage or do not manage their assets. And with those, we are not referring to furniture and equipment or computers, but infrastructure assets like facilities like roads, waste management facilities, water and sanitation systems, but also smaller assets, parks, street lighting, things like that. And we realized that this is an area that could use some perhaps fresh thinking and support. And quickly, the idea became clearer that it's really about infrastructure assets and not necessarily only municipal assets. Infrastructure assets can be managed at the local level, at the national level, and often they're managed by different layers of government with involvement of the private sector, sometimes even entirely by the private sector. And we also realized that there's often a misunderstanding between financial assets and non-financial assets. So for the sake of people not thinking that I'm a pure finance guy looking at assets and liabilities, we made it clear by saying, okay, we're talking about infrastructure assets. Why sustainable development? Well, there are some studies the UN has done on how many goals, sustainable development goals, which I hope you're familiar with, but these are sort of the goalposts of the United Nations in terms of what it wants to achieve around the world. 92% of those goals and their targets are really directly dependent or indirectly dependent, but in a very strong way on infrastructure. So that's how the title came about, Infrastructure Asset Management for Sustainable Development. As Mike mentioned, we did a handbook, and the challenge at first was really to get the time and the resources to do that handbook. We did some technical assistance around infrastructure asset management, helping local governments in a few countries around the world, small, challenging countries like Uganda, Bangladesh, Nepal, Tanzania. But we really didn't have the time or the resources to capture everything in a knowledge product. Then came COVID, and with COVID, a lot of bad things happened, but some new opportunities popped up because of people not being able to travel and resources being able to be reallocated. So we seized that opportunity and said, okay, let's all come together, use these 2 years to really write down what we've learned. And this is the table of content of the handbook. It has two parts. One is really a introduction to asset management for government officials at the city level and at the national level. And the second part is really about deep dives on certain issues related to asset management, like climate vulnerability or building asset management data systems and so forth. I'm not going to go.
Daniel,
Daniel,
1 second. I've got two things. One is just yesterday, I was talking with our colleagues at the Australian Asset Management Council, and they're very interested in connecting our value and benefits from asset management slide template to include how does your activity meet any of the UN sustainability goals. So we'll talk more about that later. directly. Yeah, we've got some meetings to have, David, or Daniel. And the other thing is, can you make the presentation full screen? We're seeing your next slide now, and if it's in the full presentation mode, it'll
so
be easier to read the slides.
It says I'm in presentation mode here. Let me just
it's in notes. We're seeing the next slide. Maybe you have to get out of it and go back in.
Yeah, let me do that. Let me just quickly stop the sharing and then
I
go
did.
back.
I Googled this issue, and it seems like if you can click on the slideshow tab at the top of your PowerPoint presenter and locate monitor group, and then uncheck use presenter view. It seems to be using the presenter view and showing notes in the next slide.
Okay, let me just first go back to sharing my screen, see if it makes any difference. Okay, that's not the one that I want to share. Okay,
that's
so
better.
this is it better or is it the same?
Yes, that's it. That's perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Here, just, this is sort of the typical slide we show when we try to make the case to governments as to why infrastructure asset management is important. I just mentioned this sort of study that over 90% of the sustainable development goals at the UN, and I'll be happy to talk about those in a second, are related to infrastructure. And there's other statistics. Data is really kind of hard to come by, in a sense that to fully understand the value of asset management. Everyone sees it, but in translating it into, for example, economic growth or financial costs, it's tricky. But there are some studies out there from the World Bank, from the Institute of Asset Management, saying that if you don't do proper maintenance, for example, which is of course key part of infrastructure asset management, you can lose up to 2% in GDP growth, which is very painful, especially for developing countries, or up to 85% of the costs associated to an asset and its lifespan actually are happening or are incurred after the construction acquisition phase. So try to hammer down those points just to sort of make sure that people understand the importance of it. Excuse me. And here's just a picture of the handbook. This is, I think, a picture taken by Linda in Bogota, Colombia. She's a great, not only a great instructor, but also a great photographer. So we use that as a cover. And to the left, you have some of the key, chapters, and some of the sort of visuals that we use in there. I'm going to go very quickly through some of these process charts, but this one is probably one that deserves a little bit of attention. It's the first step that we try to promote with local governments that we work with in our workshops. So, when we go into a new country, it starts out with us assessing the challenges, really traveling to different cities, asking a bunch of questions, spending a few days with them just to see, how they manage their assets, if they understand what asset management is, where they see their challenges. And then based on that, we go back and design a workshop. And at that workshop, we are asking local governments to first identify one priority asset that they really want to focus on, and we teach them how to prioritize according to sort of the very well-known prioritization methods. Nothing like no rocket science but it's a very helpful effort for them to talk to each other and to realize which assets are more important than others at that current point in time. And then we essentially ask them to do this sort of gap analysis, which is described here. What are you doing in terms of managing that particular asset, whether it's a road or a water sanitation system right now? What do you think could be done better? And the idea here is not to create a new detailed maintenance plan. They might have that already in place, but to really do a gap analysis at the city level so that everyone from different angles can chip in and share ideas as to how asset management for that particular asset can be improved over the long term and what is required to do so. Here are just some few other pictures. This is from our perhaps one of our most popular chapters on climate change. And this is exciting because we managed to get an expert on board with Dustin Carey, who is really leading efforts in Canada to help municipalities there build climate resilient asset management policies and strategies. And as he was developing that, he was developing this chapter. So it's very much in line with what Canada is really trying to do also at the national level. And it walks countries through a vulnerability assessment, giving them very concrete ideas how to evaluate priorities for climate change and its impact on assets, and when to take action and when not to take action, when to defer action, things like that. So it's a very helpful tool, and it also has a lot of free information sources in there as well. Just one second. Sorry, still have a little bit of a cough.
I'm glad you're doing better. You must have been pretty sick last week.
Apologies for that. I think I accidentally dropped the screen share, but I kind of showed you what I wanted to show you, which was really just sort of what the handbook looks like. And I can stop right here just if you have questions to our approach of the handbook, or go a little deeper into the challenges in its implementation. But I've talked for quite a while, so maybe I'll hand it over to you, Mike, if there's any follow-up or any ideas on that handbook and our approach to asset management, how we teach it to local governments.
Yes, quite a few actually. So you laid out that you take steps, you take time to talk with them and learn about that. So are they typically focused on something in particular, and you're answering questions about their road or their dam or their electric, or are you just giving general training, instruction, and information?
So what we do, Linda, our one of our key instructors, has developed, and then over the course of the project, which has been going on for 6 years now, refined a template for an asset management action plan. We have that plan available in many different languages, and we try to sort of customize it to the country and where things are. But essentially, they start thinking about, well, at the very beginning, they have to decide on what asset they want to focus on during the time of the workshop. So imagine a 5-day workshop. Linda has given an introduction to asset management for the first day and a half or so with some interactive exercises. Now they sit down, and they, being 4 or 5 officials at the city, typically the procurement officer, one of their engineers, finance officer, town clerk, it varies a little bit, but it's a sort of a multidisciplinary city group. And they now sit down and say, okay, let's focus on water, roads, or whatnot. So they spend an hour discussing that, right? Why is right now it is more important to focus on roads or water? And every city varies. Once they've done that, they walk through this template, and the template starts at a high level. And the first thing they really should look at is, what are your key principles for asset management that you would like to, if you could frame them and put them, in front of the town hall entrance, what would they be? We will not let our assets deteriorate, things like that. So we give them kind of a menu to choose from, or come up with their own principles. And then they go through detailed analysis, like, what are your performance goals for this particular asset? What are the stakeholders involved? Which stakeholders are super interested, which are super impacted by it, which are both, right? Now look at what kind of actions you need to take to actually move to that performance goal. How do you fund those actions? Who is involved in its implementation? And then at the very end, you have a time-bound action plan where you actually say, okay, we're going to have twice yearly inspections now instead of just once. We do it then and then. We will start an awareness raising program around recycling, for example. We will have our first community engagement meeting on that date. So the action plan is really focused on low cost solutions and activities that spur organizational change. And one of the biggest challenges we had, and we mentioned that before, is to make sure that they don't confuse an asset management action plan with a project plan. We often encounter this problem where they then say, okay, like we have an action plan, we will buy 5 new vehicles, we will buy this, we will buy that, and then the question becomes, okay, who will fund that? And those cities and very poor countries often don't have the ability to do that. So we tell them, look, this can come in 3-4 years, but what we're focusing on right now are existing assets. Or what sometimes happens is they know they will get a new asset, they will get new vehicles, they will build a new road. Let's put in place a plan, a multi-year plan to manage that asset sustainably. You will get it, you need a plan. So let's work on that. So that also happens. But what should not happen, of course, is a project proposal that is not funded, because that is not asset management.
Oh, we're losing one person who's calling us tree huggers. Sorry you feel that way, but we don't want to waste your time. So feel free to move along. But we do have a question about what if there aren't any performance targets for an asset class? And I've asked the questioner what kind of asset, for example, because there are, anybody can determine a performance category for a class of assets. I mean, even if the audience doesn't have a set of performance targets, then you can just say, this is what would be good performance targets. So, and then here's another question. How much of the training that you provide in organization focuses on cultural change that needs to occur within an organization? We love that. Daniel, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I take being called a tree hugger, I take as a compliment. I've always been an environmentalist. But
that's why I said it out loud. Yes, of course.
But I do have to say actually that part of asset management still needs strengthening, which is and you talked about the tree example before, Mike, right? How to evaluate natural assets and how to be clear about responsibilities for local governments in managing those natural assets. So that's sort of something we need to strengthen. So what I want to say on the performance goals, very important that they tie in with the national performance goals. So water is a good example, right? We don't want them just to say, okay, everyone, 100% access to water and sanitation 100% of the time. That is, in a lot of instances, not realistic, and it will be very frustrating. So, what they need to look at is really, okay, what is our national performance goal? And how far are we meeting that? And how can we improve on that? Maybe we're not even meeting it at all, and maybe it's not realistic to meet it next year. But can we move from 80% of the time access, or 90 to 95%? So we want them to be very specific and tied into their national framework, and not to be overambitious. And these discussions are very basic, but they need to happen. And often, the clarity arises during those discussions as to what actually the goal should be and can be. And that's a discussion that needs to be had at the city level. The organizational change is really the trickiest part. And talking to colleagues, for example, in pioneers in municipal asset management in Canada, Ontario has been pushing this, and based on their experiences, what you have to do is sort of have a carrot and stick approach almost, right? So organizational change will only happen if there are the proper incentives in place. You can do a lot by appealing to good human nature, obviously, but what we're really trying to do is link infrastructure asset management policies to access for capital investments, for example. And I think that's done. That's what's done in Ontario. You need to have an asset management policy in place as a municipality to apply for a capital grant. So the UN has no business to be that prescriptive in countries. It's the country's prerogative to do that, but we share these ideas with countries and say, like what we can do, for example, is give preferential access at the global level to municipalities to apply for municipal funds through the UN, through certain funds. But why don't you think about how to incentivize it at the national level? Is it really too much to ask, from a municipality to, for example, have in place an asset management action plan for an asset that they want to improve through a capital grant, right? The template is available, the guide is available, the training is available, and at the very minimum, the city should think through the next few years in terms of how it will manage that asset sustainably, right? Is that too much to ask? And some countries are asking for that already. In Uganda, this has become part of applying for a capital grant. Is and often it's not exactly the same template that we use, but it's a very useful variation of it, where they say, okay, like tell us what you're going to do to keep that asset functioning over the next few years. That's a question that wasn't asked before, right? And then, you can get into behavioral economics and things like that, how to spur organizational change. It's something that we're still thinking about. And if you have good ideas, and I'm sure you do have a lot of experience from your own organizations, please share them.
Well, there's two things there. One, you were talking about countries that are wanting to have requirements for asset management plans in order to get grants or funding. We in the United States want that. We don't have that. That is just such a basic activity. It's an economic activity. If we're going to give you money, show us how that you actually know how you're going to use it. I mean, it's so simple, yet only our transit legislation has that language in it. So we need you to say these things, and for us to know that Uganda's doing it already. Why doesn't the United States do it? So that's one thing. And then, the national goals, it's great for the United Nations to have them, but each nation has to get specific in their way of providing that cultural incentive. And again, it's economics that provides the culture change. If you want money, do this. And guess what? People start doing it. So that's what our Australian colleagues mentioned, is that it's not just the UN goals that your asset management plan should be meeting. We should have national, how does this help your national or local governance also?
I may just interject. One of the things just to mention here is, of course, the SDGs are really not UN goals in a sense that it's a sort of a secretariat approach. These, were adopted by all member states, right? So all governments, all national governments signed up to them, right? And now the question becomes, how are you implementing them? And there's actually a really interesting exercise going on outside of my project. It's much bigger than that. Where we ask cities around the world to report. It's a voluntary reporting mechanism to report on, how they implement the SDGs at the city level, and that then guides a lot of their actions. So, I can happy to share links with you later on that. It's really interesting to read, from cities all around the world how they manage to translate this very ambitious global agenda into what they're doing every day in the city, and that links asset management in a very concrete way to global goals.
Yes.
It's happening, not nearly enough, but it's happening even in some US cities, but not nearly enough.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so Guy Harness is talking more about these, how many failures can an asset suffer without affecting the performance of the system. So now that's asset management. Now, what we're talking about with Daniel is really the asset leadership part of this whole process. And the leaders have to determine how many failures can happen. But we're not talking about the actual touching the assets so that they work. And it's a hard thing for us to articulate and for people to understand, but we're talking about the asset leadership part of it. And that's why it's so great to be talking with you, because the United Nations clearly a leader. So we've got a bunch of questions from Marty Rowland, and then Cecilia is going to join us again, Moat from Strategies and Sites. And Marty is interested in knowing if you're talking with tribes at all and states. What's your stakeholders? You know, do you speak with mayors and governors and chiefs? And then one of the most important stakeholder is the taxpayer. How do you bring that perspective into what you do?
Yeah, these are really excellent questions. Thank you so much. I see one, I don't know if you read that, also, you know, very interesting. Are cities more successful at this than countries? And I think in terms of integrating SDGs into concrete, you know, into their development plans, it really depends on what country you're looking at. You know, I would argue that in the US, yes, some cities are more successful linking that directly than, you know, at the sort of national level. But in other countries, you know, the national government may be a bit more resourceful than some of their cities. But the further you go outside into developing countries, the more familiar people are actually with the Sustainable Development Goals. And at the local level, you'd be surprised as to, you know, how much buy-in there actually is. So it's a reaffirming experience because they're not very well known here in the US and in much of Europe either. I'm originally from Germany. It's very similar there as well. So, you know, who are the stakeholders? Stakeholders are local governments primarily. What local governments are is another question, right? We usually say, you know, anything that is subnational. So you go down from the sort of country-wide government to the state, provincial level. You can go down to, you know, the municipal, city level, town level. We don't go all the way down to the sort of community ward level, but we do focus more and more on, you know, how we can encourage local governments, city officials, to include community and asset management. And there are some interesting examples out there. We can't take credit for them. They go way, you know, goes way back before the project even started. But, you know, where indigenous communities, for example, I think it was in Chile or in Peru, I'll give you the exact details, but where they were entrusted with managing certain segments of a road, for example, right? So they become asset managers of that asset that goes through their part of the community, and you can see huge improvements in the way those assets are managed. Some of the regional development banks have experimented with, you know, empowering women to become asset managers, infrastructure asset management, with great results. So we're really trying to figure out, you know, how local governments can improve community involvement. Who to involve at the local government level is not an easy decision, because you have the elected officials and then you have the technical officials, right? So you do need the political buy-in of the mayor and the elected officials and the council, but you know, they are facing huge political incentives to do things short term, right? They want to be re-elected. You know, it's sometimes tricky to tell them, put aside some money for the long term so you can do better asset management. You do need to engage the technical people, because they are doing it on a day-to-day basis, and they also are most likely to stay on board after the mayor changes, right? So usually what we try to do is get a mayor or deputy mayor, or at least a high-level technical official with a direct line of reporting to the mayor, and then the technical group that we identify as key stakeholders in that city. And the stakeholder identification happens before the workshop. It happens through those field missions that I described earlier, where we actually ask the cities themselves, look, this is asset management. This is what we think is important. Who do you think are the key people in your government that should be involved if we were to put together an asset management team? So they are in charge of nominating, you know, the stakeholders in this new asset management team that we're trying to establish in these. Sorry, I don't know if I addressed everything, Mike, but let me know.
You did. I was going to say how excellent you did. That Amelia's question about, cities or nations doing it. It's asset management is holistic. The management system thinking that we're wanting to bring forward implies involvement of many interconnecting systems, and that includes governance. So it kind of has to work on a national and city level. And they've been saying for years in the United States that cities are where things get done. Next week, we're going to have Christina Benty as our guest, and she was the mayor of a 5,000 person town in Canada, Golden, Canada. And she says, if your federal government goes out of business, you won't know about it for a month. If your state government goes out of business, you won't know for a week. But if your local government goes out of business, you're going to know it the first time you try to flush your toilet. I mean, it's immediate. So the role of the municipal asset manager is just like closer to the people. So, and I loved your example of the indigenous people with the road going through their area. That's how our federal and states highways systems work also. But they have to follow the state or the federal regulations. So everything has to work interdependently. So Cecilia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. And oh, Daniel, it's so good to see you. And thank you for sharing again and going through and reviewing how you guys are doing this. I had a couple of questions and you sort of answered them when you said you have both the elected officials and the technical officials. One question I wondered is when you get those 5 government folks that you're going to be training, do you ever find that you have the people that are in charge of constituents and the citizens, the ones that hear from the citizen stakeholders? Because as things are being prioritized in terms of what thing they're going to tackle, making sure that we have somebody that has the voice of those that are the end users of the services provided by the government is pretty critical. Or at least somebody who can say, what are the things that we hear are problematic for us most often versus what's my pet project?
Right. I mean, again, so local governments we're collaborating with are usually not the biggest cities in the country. They can be, it depends, but they can be quite small, 50, 100,000 people, cities like that. So people that work in that government, they live there, they usually have a pretty good idea of what works and what doesn't. But you do have heated discussions. For example, we had discussions about garbage pickup, level, like how much of the garbage should be reliably picked up every week. And, where are we right now? Some would say 50%, some would say 70, some would say 90, huge discrepancies. And you really have to dig deeper a lot of times. And yeah, sometimes we realize, look, there seems to be someone missing here that might have a better idea of that asset. So maybe it's not a good asset to focus on for this workshop. It is your priority asset. We don't have the expertise here. Let's focus on what you have an expertise on. That sometimes happens. We also try to involve community development officers that have usually quite a good idea of what's happening in the community and are not often part of these asset management teams. I mean, often these teams don't exist in the first place, but even if they do, it can be more male dominated, sort of engineering, finance, that kind of thing. But you do need to have someone who's the link to the community. One of the things we also ask them to do is once they design the asset management action plans, and here we come back to the carrot and stick approach, and we don't have a lot of sticks at the end, but what we're saying is, look, you want to be a certified UN certified asset manager, or at least have some, certification that shows that you've done this. We do need you to go home, discuss this action plan with people in your local government and with your local council, have it endorsed and adopted by the local council. When that is the case, we'll certify you. and and we've done that in the beginning. We haven't done that. We learned that over time, and it makes things, like slower. But we know then, that this is an action plan that is actually somewhat realistic and has some political buy-in and corresponds to the needs on the ground. And we go from there, so that's what we learned sort of by doing, also as an incentive to change organizational culture.
Your microphone's not on, Cecilia.
Sorry about that, guys. I think changing it by drilling down to the level of adoption, ordinance type adoption, where you are systematizing the process and the program, is really critical. And that's a great learning that you had. One of the things I wondered about as you were discussing this, when you sit down to do the training with your clients at the local government levels, do you find that many of them already have a structured asset management process? Or what percentage do you say have actually really addressed this? Because the leadership question, that when Mike says we're talking about asset leadership, I call it having a mindset towards asset management that has to do with the mission and making it a strategic plan. So you have to have a strategy, an overarching strategy that, even in the US, while we may manage our assets in various categories, do we have an overarching that ties back to the mission of the organization, the mission of the government, which is citizen services and provision for citizens and operations? So any thoughts on what percentage of your folks have had that?
I mean, in terms of, having a asset management framework or strategy in place at the local level, I have not seen that yet, in any of the local governments. I have to say that in Kenya, we were pleasantly surprised that they actually had in place asset management units in their local governments. That was the first local governments that we encountered out of our 10 project countries that had that in place, calling it asset management units. And after a while, I found out why, because some very great people that were somewhat an inspiration for this program and that did work for the World Bank have worked with Kenya on that before and have helped to introduce the concept of municipal asset management there with some effect. And now we're sort of picking up on that. Other than that, no, I wouldn't say it's there. At the national level, you sometimes have asset management policies in place, but just to give you an example, and I'm not going to name the country, but just yesterday I was on the phone with one senior official in the government at the national level, and they contacted us and said, we would like to revise our asset management policy. And I tried to ask them more questions about the asset management policy, which I read. It's about a 50-page document. Not bad, like a lot of stuff is still missing, a lot of assets are missing, but quite details in terms of, what departments have what responsibility. And I asked them, like, who did that, and what's the status of implementation, and were there any donors involved? And he said, honestly, I don't know. Someone just sent this to me yesterday. Apparently, we did that 3-4 years ago, and a consultant, some expert might have written it, but it never went anywhere. So we need to start from scratch. So you might have these policy drafts in place, but they're really not institutionalized. And so that teaches us also a little bit, about how to do it, right? You can hire consultants to draft an excellent asset management policy and leave it with the government, but nothing will change. You need to have this sort of iterative process of workshops. That the policy needs to be discussed over maybe a year or two, and then presented to the parliament, cabinet, local council, wherever it is. And that has happened in very few cases. Uganda is a bit more advanced now with their asset management policy, but I still don't know if it's approved at the national cabinet level. I'm not sure. So that's rare to have it at the national level, and even less so at the local level, to have a real asset management policy in place.
Yes, and it's not unusual even here in the US to not have that overarching policy at a level that then drills down. And I think we're getting better at that. I've even seen some of that in terms of the way the current administration is doing what it's doing in the US to try and drill down through internal government departments and then reach out and go forward. One of the things I was curious about also is, well, two things. You mentioned the fact that they have these policies and that might be on the shelf, which is what happens in most instances for organizations. If they haven't done this kind of detailed iterative work, like you were saying, to take the policy and say, how are we going to operationalize this? And bringing in all the internal and external stakeholders, often these kind of strategies stay on the shelf. I'm curious also if you've looked at any past asset management processes that they have maybe not looked at recently to know what's happening. To what degree do you see where they are today, but do you delve into the historical, what they used to do?
Yeah, not really. You know, like our assessments, diagnostic tools, they're all geared towards the present, but obviously understanding the history behind it would be important. And you know, asset management in different forms has been done, right, for hundreds of years. I mean, you know, and it's just you know, some countries are doing it, but are not calling it that. You know, and they may be, you know, processes in place that are fine. You know, things are working, and they don't need to adopt the UN or ISO approach to asset management, right? But you know, and in most cases, that culture of, you know, we are all asset managers is not there, and this is one approach that we would like to promote. But I think what I would like to understand a little bit more is, you know, the history of asset management, and maybe it was called government property management, or you know, whatever it was called earlier, right? Yeah.
That's an important tweak to the process, I think, because oftentimes one of the issues that you face is that people have ownership of those past processes. And if you don't acknowledge the value of those or the pitfalls of those, you're bound to repeat the history. You know, if you don't look at your
One
history.
of the things that Asset Leadership Network has done, because we do a little bit of what you're doing, Daniel, with our executive briefings. We go in and help organizations understand, and frequently what we're doing is helping settle turf battles and let everybody know that this is a big deal and we need to play nicely, and everyone has to share their information and things like that. When they hear it from an outside source, it's a little bit easier for them to make that cultural change. That's what, you know, leaders have brought us in to do that, help them from that perspective. And we've got an interesting question here from Andre Uloa. And are there any asset management processes that you would not recommend to smaller organizations, smaller countries or smaller cities or smaller organizations, I'm not sure, that are just establishing their asset management programs? And I'll let you answer, but I've got a response for that too. Daniel?
You know, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, I don't have a answer to that, in a sense that our process, the way we introduce it, is so basic that we believe, you know, even very small governments in very challenging circumstances with a lot on their plate can still do it. But, you know, the question becomes very important, for example, when it comes to, you know, asset registries and collecting the data that you need, you know. So one of the key insights we try to impart is, you know, look, you need data, but not, you know, tons of data to do better, right? You need to really, you know, use your resources very wisely to get the information for your assets that you need. And don't make the mistake of spending too much time collecting too much data that you then cannot use. there are a typical thing, that also comes to mind is software. One of the biggest asks we always get is like, okay, we went to your workshop. When are you giving us the software that will do our job? Asset management software, right? And we're like, it will not do your job. It won't work unless you understand asset management. And there simple things will go wrong. We went to one country where another donor agency has introduced a way of registering your assets, or at least keeping track of the conditions of your assets, infrastructure assets, right? So there was a program on roads, and if that is not designed properly and people are not educated properly, it will not do you any good. We were sitting down on the computer and looking at the program, and we just said, okay, like, give us an overview now of the conditions of your road in your city. Now, how do you get that data? And then it turned out they couldn't. And the reason was because there was one feature in the software that would allow you to relabel the entries. So some would put road, some would put roads, some would put feeder roads, and it just didn't end up together in one overview database, right? So and people didn't notice because no one was using the data because it wasn't there, but they were all still entering. So these are simple examples of why certain things could not work. There may be AI solution, machine learning that work, here maybe in New York City. You can take pictures from cars of electricity poles and maybe have some algorithm that tells you whether it needs repair or not because it's tilted a certain way. This may work well here and be innovative, but it may not work in a small city in Africa. But still lessons could be learned from that.
Daniel, I will tell you that AI, just like
I was gonna say, I'm sorry, Cecilia, that the question about the size of the organization is kind of a wrong question, because if you are a volunteer mayor of a small city and you only have a police station, a fire station, a post office, a school, it's big to you.
Yeah.
You're trying to do your regular job and be the volunteer mayor. So I don't see that there's any small organization. And then what we learned from building information models is level of detail. So you don't need all of the detail about the chair. You just need that you know that you need a chair in this room. We can get to other details later. So what you were saying about the information policy is perfectly right. You want to instruct and tell people to have an information set. And yes, there's ways of filter roads, anything with road in it. But if you can avoid that, that's a good first step into keeping things simple. And that's the best thing, is to do something that you can succeed at is a good starting point. Don't take the most challenging
But
activity.
I agree with you, Mike, with that. But the point that I think Daniel was making, that I was going to make comment to, and I agree with you, that there is no size of organization that cannot use these principles. We've talked about that. Even as an individual, you can use an asset management approach to dealing with all the things you have in your life to deal with, even drilling down that far. But on the database side and software and artificial intelligence, AI side, it still maintains the same issue: garbage in, garbage out. And so if we do not understand why we're putting the chair in the room and who is going to use the chair, how long they need to use the chair, we will not know what chair to put in the room or where to place it. We need to have the stakeholders that will be utilizing whatever that asset is, an understanding of the workflow process of acquiring it, maintaining it, utilizing it, and disposing of it. All of that has to be part of what you do for an asset. So the first thing you do for acquiring an asset is understand utilization, who, the what, the why, and then the how much. and then the rest. And when you say 85% of the cost is after the acquisition, you are absolutely correct. And 85% of the headache is also after the acquisition. Well, or maybe in the disposition too. So when we've heard folks speak about what they do with the asset management plans they have, one of the things that they have noticed is critical, even in the governmental side and defense, is decommissioning. What do you do with those things that you're not going to use after they've outlived their life? And the quantification issue that you talked about, the measurements, I'm curious, Daniel, if you can speak to that. What things you use from your vulnerability assessment to maybe show if you don't do this, then your cost could be, i.e., like Daniel Ortiz likes to say, risk management. Quantifying by risk management. How do you do that for them?
We have some, yeah, I mean, if you look at our chapter on climate vulnerability, there's some really, striking data as to, the costs of not investing in resilience. I don't have the number in my head, but that's one of our most powerful presentations always when we can get Dustin Carey, the author of this climate vulnerability chapter, to come with us to our workshops and present the cost of not protecting your assets. In terms of the the decommissioning part, two interesting things that just come to mind. So one is that actually, like this issue of asset management really became a big issue in the international development organizations after sort of the breakdown of the Soviet Union, and the issue of decommissioned military facilities that were now handed over to local governments or state-owned facilities that had no use anymore, and had to be recommissioned. So a lot of land and building issues came up as to how to evaluate those assets, how to make better use of it at the local level. So that was like one of the things that really pushed municipal asset management at the international level. And what we've seen when it comes to sort of the decommissioning or disposing of assets, the biggest problem is time, is a lack of speediness of the bureaucratic procedure to decommission those assets. So, we were in Uganda, for example, visiting a district there, talking. So it was a big group. It was really, lively group of 30, 40 people from different local governments, including the Ministry of Local Governments at the national level. And so the district engineer there was telling us about his frustration. I saw an ambulance car there that was completely deteriorated. I was like, why, what are you using it? It's like, no, we're not using it. Why is it deteriorating? Well, we tried to sell it the last 5 years, but we haven't gotten approval from the government, because every asset you need to sell at the local government needs to be approved at the national level before you sell it. And so then a very lively exchange started between the guy from the national government and the local government. I didn't see that letter. No, you sent it, that kind of thing. But it is a problem, that you have this huge bureaucracy in place of, which is meant to increase transparency and control and checks and balances, but it's just not working. It's red tape. And in the meantime, what happens is those assets deteriorate, sit there, and they get salvaged, for spare parts and all kinds of things. So it's that process of decommissioning that really where assets lose a lot of their value and their use.
Excellent. So this is a great way to end. Where do you want to go with the UN's asset management program, and how can the Asset Leadership Network help you?
Great question. Ideally, this would continue pretty much forever, because I don't see this work ending anytime soon. You need to, have some program in place that promotes this idea of we are all asset managers, not only if we work for local governments, right? I mean, one of the first slides we always use is, what can I learn from my motorcycle or my car, whatever is the means of transportation where we are, the most common one, right? And just to drive home the point, you are an asset manager, as Cecilia just said, we are all asset managers. As soon as you own something, even if you don't own anything, your body, right? I mean, it's an asset, you need to manage it, right? So that understanding, and then bring that to the local level and make it, something that is entrenched and really, there as an approach, that requires a lot more work, not only at the UN level, at all levels, really. But what I would like to learn from you all, because organizations, corporations are obviously further ahead with asset management than in terms of having it as a valid system-wide approach than most local governments, right? And what are the lessons learned that have successfully driven behavioral change in your organizations? This whole idea that you asked me, or that question that you asked me, is like, how do you change organizational culture successfully? I think we have a lot to learn from the private sector there, but it's challenging, of course, to apply to a completely different stakeholder. But that kind of thinking, I would like to really hear your thoughts and continue to engage in the conversation, because that's the biggest challenge.
Well, excellent. We couldn't ask for any better way to end this than to say continue in the discussion. And actually, Cecilia and I are meeting with Daniel Ortiz Plata next Monday to talk about Colombia. So yes, we do plan on continuing the discussion. I see many different ways that can happen. And with all of the audience engagement we've had with this, I think there's going to be choices for you on how we can help you achieve your mission. So thank you for helping us achieve ours, which is to spread the word about asset management, governance, and structures, and how they can help the world one organization at a time. And before we go, I do want to thank our organizational members again. And we'll start again by thanking you and Linda. It's been a great 3-week series with you. We've learned so much, and our audience has been really engaged. We're very appreciative of the time you've spent with us. So thank you. And thank you to our organizational members, Onuma Inc., our patron members, Definitive Logic, ABS Quality Evaluations, CGI, and Jacobs. And of course, thank you to our organizational members. Special thanks to Strategies Insight. Cecilia, thanks for joining us in these calls. And next week, I don't have a picture of Christina, but she's the former mayor of Golden. And we'll be giving her some of these highlights that we've created so that she can understand how she's continuing this conversation about municipalities and government asset management. So, and thank you to our audience that expanded for the UN programs. People like hearing what the UN has to say. And thank you again, Cecilia, for joining us, and Daniel. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Nick.
Bye.
Bye.